One of the most interesting things about this incredibly controversial game is simply the fact that it was so original and well made, which was a problem because at the time its controversy was pretty well justified.
It looks like this goes all the way to the top. I can't trust anyone, least of all the police, and time's running out. I've got to get the one piece of evidence that will expose Starkweather without a shadow of a doubt. Footage and testimony of a man who was executed by the state 5 hours ago.
Hey, tough guy, wake up. You're not dead. Pick up the ears. Put it on. Go on. That's better. Now only you can hear me. And that's the way you're gonna want it, because I'm your only way out of here. I'll try to direct you as best I can, but other than that, you're on your own. It's up to you. Okay, are you ready? Camera, action.
It shared a striking similarity with the Saw movie franchise released the previous year.
Your aim in this game is to kill Adam.
And is very much a product of that grungy 90s and post-millennium period where psychological horror was propagated by directors like David Fincher. Everything was just depressing and overlaid in a green and blue colour filter. Spawned from the minds of Rockstar, the absolute ballers behind the Grand Theft Auto franchise, it shouldn't have been a surprise that it handled its sensitive subject matter pretty insensitively, but got away with it due to the super refined gameplay and trademark sprinkling of humour. The game hides behind a thin veil of satire, supposedly poking fun at Western values that actively encourage kids to take out every enemy they can see in games, as long as said enemy is clearly defined as the bad guy. It was a notoriously thin excuse though, because it's hard to argue that this game is actually satire when you're encouraged to take an extra few seconds to get your reticule to turn from white to yellow and eventually to red if you're really patient, which triggers increasingly brutal ways to murder your enemies. And so where GTA ruffled a few feathers, Manhunt sent the ratings boards running for their shotguns. But for all of its attention-grabbing controversy, Manhunt actually had an original and intriguing story. Basically, you're a death row inmate named Cash, implied to be a cartel enforcer or something along those lines. And when you're supposed to get the lethal injection, instead a powerful man referred to as the Director, voiced by none other than Brian Cox.
Happy Christmas, you clock-watching fucks.
Yep, that Brian Cox.
Oh, fuck off.
Pulls some strings and extracts poor Cash so that he can play a little game. And the game is to force Cash to navigate locations like abandoned shopping malls and junkyards and so on, where psychotic gang members have been paid to kill you. The catch being that this is a snuff movie and the director wants to see maximum carnage. So along with your objectives, he also gives you hints that give you a constant edge. Hence, the more brutal the kill, the more style points you get. It's never really obvious whether Cash himself derives pleasure from the grisly kills or if he's just appeasing the director's insatiable bloodlust. But what is obvious is that as a player, you have more in common with the director than you do Cash, because what gamer can resist the temptation of a high score or indeed a doomed glory kill? And so naturally you find yourself engaging in the morally dubious act of viciously murdering countless enemies on your journey in the most absurdly over-the-top ways. A like or better yet a subscribe is literally the currency that allows YouTube to pay me, so a little click from you is a massive win for me. Thank you so much. Shadows and stealth largely dominate the combat, and while the melee weapons such as hammers, garrote wires and machetes eventually make way for firearms, the melee kills remain your signature takedown. Where the game really takes an upward turn, however, is when the director betrays you halfway through by bringing your family into the picture and then, well, taking them out the picture. This leads to Cash breaking free of his control, and from here on out you team up with a rogue reporter to break the story.
Everything I need is in that box under the table.
Good. Take it and get out of town.
But you're not coming with me?
I'm going to deal with Starkweather personally.
And end up with corrupt police and the director's elite guards chasing you.
Nobody gets anywhere near Starkweather. Give me the key. Yes, sir.
Who interestingly are also voiced by the now iconic John Bernthal. Honestly, this guy spends so much time covered in fake blood, I'm surprised he ever wipes it off. The decrepit murder houses are then swapped out for sewers and private residencies as you begin to work your way ever closer to the man behind the curtain. Still relying on savage melee kills, you start to feel a little less guilty about the horror of the situation as you realize that with each kill, you're dismantling a startlingly terrifying organization and getting some righteous payback along the way. Although it might seem like a little glowworm in a pitch-black chasm, Rockstar's unique brand of humor never drops off, with nothing less than a chainsaw-wielding psychotic cannibal in a pighead's mask confronting you in the final chapters. The same could be said about the difficulty, which actually ramps up significantly once your enemies have firearms, but due to the significant challenge rating, the satisfaction of progressing through the levels cannot be denied, regardless of how you choose to take your enemies down. Sadly, the game was shrouded in controversy in 2004 when linked to the tragic murder of 14-year-old Stefan Pereira by his 17-year-old friend Warren LeBlanc in England. Rockstar understandably denied any possible connection, while the media did their best to stir up a frenzy, and ultimately it turned out to be hot air as the game transpired to have been found in the victim Stefan's room and not his assailant LeBlanc's. Furthermore, it was revealed to be a drug-related crime anyway, cementing the case shut. Now, with all of that in mind, if you think the first game was violent and controversial, then consider this. It only got banned in Italy, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, and Ireland. 3 years later, Rockstar were back with Manhunt 2 for the Wii, PS2, and PSP. It was so bleak and focused around the executions that first the UK and then the US denied the game a rating. Motivated by conservative groups and general watchdogs alike who took particular offense over the Wii controller that could be used to mimic the killing moves. This was the pre-digital download era, so these widespread bans on store copies effectively crippled the release, meaning Rockstar had to make some last-minute changes to the content. Now, I really can't get into this without some fairly major story spoilers, so if you intend to play the game, I'd skip this bit. Otherwise, let's get stuck in. One example of what they chose to remove was all but 2 of the narrative-specific decapitations.
Georgie boy, come on in!
Now remember, this is supposed to be a squeamish everyman who's averse to violence, and already you can tell that the game doesn't really take itself all that seriously. And by decapitation, I don't just mean lopping your victim's head off. For context, here is a crowbar kill on the Wii, and here it is on the uncut version for the PC. In this case, they just removed the end bit where he literally explodes a guy's face with a practiced flick of the wrist. Other times, they change the animation entirely. They also removed the ability to castrate somebody with garden shears, although you could still do it with pliers, so thank goodness for the small ones. And they also added varying sensors on screen depending on the platform. And finally, beyond the executions, more importantly, they removed innocent bystanders, who could either be spared, which would trigger the good ending, where our protagonist wins the fight for his mind, or they could be killed, which would lead to the bad ending, where Danny loses his mind forever. Not all PC platforms subscribe to a rating system, and so an uncut version which restored much of the original content found its way onto PCs 2 years later in 2009. But back in 2007, the official disc release was the only way to play, so the censorship boards held all the cards. After making these changes, Rockstar eventually received the ratings that they needed, and despite a third-party patch to remove the censor appearing within hours of release, and prominent global figures such as Hillary Clinton writing personally to the censorship boards and asking why the rating was dropped in spite of the changes, the game still made it to the UK and US store shelves, which was essential in order for Rockstar to turn a profit. It was still banned in Germany, Malaysia, New Zealand, and South Korea, and Rockstar never even bothered submitting it to Australia's infamously strict classification board, rendering it unsellable there. Gameplay-wise, as with most sequels, it played much like the original with tweaks to the mechanics. Standing still so as not to be seen in the shadows became a thing, but Really, it just reinforced how unrealistic the shadow mechanic was, with the enemies regularly staring at you from 2 feet away before moving on. On top of that, the immersion was further compromised by dopey AI enemies who are slower than ever to allow for the wind-up, as well as the trademark one-use items of the first game like the shiv or famously the plastic bag, being almost entirely replaced by unbreakable melee weapons. This meant that you would find yourself practically swimming in tools of death that you would swap out based purely on execution preference and nothing else, which further reinforced that Rockstar were now prioritizing the executions over the tense atmosphere of the first game, because much of that tension was generated as you carefully navigated behind enemies while you hunted for another makeshift weapon. Story-wise, rather than the 90s psychological horror vibe of the first game, this time we get something a little more old school, drawing inspiration from 70s spy thrillers and Cold War conspiracies. It is without question an intriguing and well-constructed tale, as we've come to expect from Rockstar, with the Manchurian Candidate undertone that has the protagonist Danny waking with no memory in a mental institution, and only his friend Leo Kasper on hand to help.
We did it.
The fact that you often can't see Leo and yet somehow he talks to you as if through an earpiece pretty much tells you that Leo is imaginary from the get-go.
You want to get out of here? Then come on.
Although oddly, it is revealed in the story as if it's like a big twist or something. Probably for the kids who shouldn't be playing it, but clearly are.
I'll scout ahead, Danny. Get your head straight and follow me.
As the game progresses, unraveling the specifics of their relationship is part of what drives the core narrative. Your journey takes you through numerous locations, some of which are so excessively grim that they're basically parodies of real horror. And so in these places, the enemies are clearly defined as fair game. The problem is not all of the levels are that simple. We have nurses, honest security guards, mentally challenged inmates, misinformed police officers, and countless other innocent people serve as the canvas upon which you are encouraged to enact a bloody symphony. But Danny is not a killer like Cash was. Straight from the outset, he insists he doesn't want to kill anybody, doing so only at Leo's insistence.
I don't want to hurt anybody.
If he sees you, he will kill you, understand? Waste him.
I killed him. I feel sick.
And yet here you are being presented with a choice to either kill your enemy or brutalize them. This apparently mundane choice to align yourself with the narrative or to indulge is actually anything but mundane, because if you only use the white reticule to kill, effectively you're doing what is necessary to progress and survive.
I'm sick of this.
In essence, doing as Danny would do, because he's out to learn about his past and nothing more. If you wind up to red, you are enabling Leo, the sociopath, to come forward and have his way, as he has insidious plans to weaken and break Danny's mind through carnage and murder. Leo's bloody executions, along with speed and total kill count, would all help improve your style score at the end of the level. And earning 3 or more stars on 5 consecutive levels would trigger this ending in which Leo's mind takes over.
I won!
It is considered the bad ending, but actually it just makes sense, because if you choose to take actions which simply don't align with the narrative, then the narrative is adjusted accordingly. It was an original and very clever mechanic, and would no doubt have proved to be a fascinating thought experiment if you could have analysed player choices across the planet, as it bears more than a passing resemblance to the infamous Milgram shock experiment. This is actually relevant to the difference between Manhunt 1 and 2, so please don't quit the video just yet. This study was run in 1961 by a psychologist at Yale University not long after World War II, who was fascinated by the relationship between obedience to authority versus personal conscience. They placed an actor in a fake electric chair and then encouraged a volunteer, separated only by a screen, to administer electric shocks. Presuming it was another volunteer they were electrocuting, they were encouraged to ignore the victim's screams and keep upping the voltage, all the while being assured repeatedly that they would bear none of the legal or moral responsibility. By absolving them of all liability, that also absolved them of the guilt. This was done in an attempt to prove that German soldiers were not responsible for the orders issued by the Nazis, because virtually anybody could do awful things given the right environment and pressure.
Go on, try it. See how it feels to own a life.
The results were as fascinating as the experiment because about 2/3 continued to administer shocks up until the victim's fictional death.
Nice one, Danny. Nice.
And even more interestingly, the results were largely the same when the experiment was repeated over the following years with different control groups. Now I bring this up because I think it's exceptionally relevant when understanding the difference between Manhunt 1 and 2, and the intelligence behind the design process.
You just won't fucking die, will you?
The first game metaphorically twisted your arm into performing the gruesome kills.
You're doing fine, Cash, just fine. We're getting some great material here. Keep going.
By doing this, it would effectively absolve you of any guilt, leaving you detached and less affected by the violence, and therefore more able to enjoy the tense atmosphere and absurd executions. But the second left you with a far nastier taste in your mouth after playing it, because enemies' sins were far less clear.
Rent-a-cops. I doubt these suckers even know who's paying them.
The savagery of some of the animations was so over the top, it entered murder fantasy territory. And it unshackled you from having no choice, meaning the executions became a guilty pleasure. But if you chose to indulge, it would deliver you a bad ending, completing the cycle and providing the player with a moral message about cause and effect. Right?
Wrong.
See, this is where it gets interesting. The ratings boards felt the, I quote, sustained and cumulative casual sadism posed a risk to the public. This sounds like an exaggeration if I'm honest, but that was their stance and they stuck with it. And so, as I mentioned, Rockstar cut some content. But what I didn't say is that this included removing the score screen at the ends of the levels, presumably in an effort to not trivialize your actions, as well as getting rid of civilians, so your victims would be restricted only to those who are hostile towards you. But by doing this, they removed the two elements which triggered literally the only mechanic in the game that would clearly hold you accountable for the way that you played. Yes, the game enabled, in fact encouraged casual sadism, but the outcome was intended to reflect this in kind. And so it was. On the Wii, PS2 and PSP, the final level, called Personality Clash, forces you to fight Leo in your mind and put your wife's memory to rest. After you achieved this, however many victims you ripped to pieces on your journey, you would still receive the wholesome ending, in which Danny or a version of him walks away into the sunset, with Leo's personality crushed forever. You would then unlock a bonus level called Release Therapy, in which you played as Leo having to kill Danny in his mind, the end of which is Leo taking control. It was presented as an alternate ending and not the result of your choices. The PC version was then sold on platforms that didn't subscribe to these rating systems and as such is uncut, meaning it includes the score screens, uncensored content and endings as was originally intended, but as the vast majority of people played Manhunt 2 as intended on consoles, the ratings boards unintentionally engineered a release that's still the most graphic murder simulator to be found on store shelves, yet due to the change up in the ending is ironically worse than what was originally submitted for approval, because it's arguably even more casual in the way in which it treats sadism. For all of that though, while the general vibe of the game is certainly nihilistic and almost grimdark in its portrayal of a seedy underworld that exists virtually in plain sight, it just isn't anything like the true horror of the first. It plays out more like a sort of spy thriller with like a giant helping of murder on the side, which itself was so cartoonish and comically over the top that it effectively dissipates any tension that the few genuinely scary parts of the game managed to build anyway. And once you'd seen the animation 24 times, it would get old. which gave way to the game's biggest issue of all. Without the kills, the game was actually quite monotonous. The enemies were stupid, the levels were simplistic, the narrative was sparsely laid out between them, the weapons were too overpowered, which sapped much of the challenge, and, assuming you were invested in the story, then your actions became more deplorable the further into the game you got, unlike the first that started to show a glimmer of hope as you reached the home run. The sad truth is that the controversy was the most noteworthy aspect of the game, and even if Rockstar didn't have to contend with the financial risk of another ratings board upset, they still needed to face the fact that the snuff movie premise of the original didn't leave much space for expansion, and as a result the series suffered for it. Suffered so badly, in fact, that with absolute titans like GTA and not long after Red Dead Redemption being the other 2 points of Rockstar's profits triangle, Manhunt managed to perform its most effective kill on itself. And that was the end of Manhunt.